and they're going to talk about their new book. And they'll talk for about half an hour, and then we'll go to questions. So welcome everybody, and also since this is our last meeting of this year, I wish everybody a good holiday and a good new year. So, Alessandra, it is to you.
Thanks, David, for the kind introduction. I hope you all hear me well. I just see one person. Okay, on Zoom, it's do you all hear us? Yes? So I think I can take off my mask. Yeah. All right, yeah. And let me add that the book is co-edited by myself and Florin Coman-Kund. We both work at Erasmus School of Law, and we are joined in this presentation by one of the authors in the book, Marijn van der Sluis, which we see on Zoom, and he used to be with us in Rotterdam and now is in Maastricht, and I'm also a fellow here at the UI. So let's start with a brief presentation, how we conceive that for a book. We will just give a brief introduction on the main ideas of the book, and then we move to some of the findings, what's new, what is that the books convey, and we conclude with Marijn. That's a strategic choice we had because it's one of the most critical of the driving concept in the book. So we thought let's close with an opening actually, rather than with a closure. All right, so we will alternate Zoom present. Apologize for some of the little glitch that will probably be part of this presentation. Let me start by saying a few words of why another book on expertise. We have read so much about these themes that the fields seem overcrowded and exaggerated, and yet the theme remain extremely important. The question of the expertise in policy making, in lawmaking was known since a very long time, and here, being of Italian origin, I cannot resist the temptation to start with a quote from Machiavelli, who was already saying in 1513 in The Prince, the holder of the God's eye view of the entire state is neither the king who looks down at the people from the top of the hierarchy, nor the people who see the king at the top from the lower state. It is a person like himself, a man of knowledge. So it is from this premise that the man of knowledge is actually the men and women of knowledge, of course, are the one who exercise a lot of power in our and in previous society, that we want to reflect and on a central theme of how to hold, if possible at all, this actor who exercise this form of interstitial power accountable. And this is also a particular urgent theme in our times because of the backlash against technocracy that we see, and probably one of its extreme form finds reflection in what we could call anti-scientific populism. And we add the label anti-scientific, not to take any position on whether populism is good or bad, but at least there is a certain type where there is a total rejection of science that is at best problematic. All right, so I'll just select, given that we have little time, on one of the problem that we conceptualize in the book, that is what we call the nobody problem. And again, given my classic tradition, I resort to the metaphor of Ulysses. Maybe some of you remember the story of Homerus, in which Ulysses, when he is confronted with the giant Polypheme, the monster, the Polypheme asks him, "What's your name?" And he answered, "Nobody." So once Ulysses blinds him and Polypheme asks help for the fellow giants, Polypheme shouts, "Nobody has blinded me." And that's the way that Ulysses finds to escape the monsters. So we think that this metaphor applies well in many settings of our decision-making institutions, where decisions are taken by actors which are far hidden from sight. And this could lead to what we call accountability deficits. And of course, in terms of examples, I guess all of you here can think of many, but just think of your mobile phone. Who decide on the safety of this radiation? Well, it is a quite hidden body, which is actually private body and sort of an NGO in Germany, and de facto is the principal setter of standards for mobile phones. So we don't know about that, and yet it's an object that we use in our daily life. And like this, we have many of these examples in the book. Now, in tension with this first problem of the nobody, that is the expert, the exercise authority, far from public scrutiny, there is another one, that if we are very adamant about accountability, we could also think of a scenario in which experts that would be very much under public scrutiny might shy away from taking up roles in the policy-making area, because these are the type of experts we are discussing. And so we could enter into the problems that nobody wants to act as expert in context of regulatory governance, our other dimension of the nobody problem. And on this line, I pass the word on to my colleague Florin, who will tell something about the structure of the book and the main concept. Florin, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Alessandra, and well, also thank you to the organizers of this event for well, creating the opportunity for us to present the, let's say, this book project. Without further ado, I'm going to continue, let's say, along the lines highlighted by Alessandra, by introducing basically the core concepts on which this book project actually is founded. And of course, looking also at the title and the focus, then the core concepts were expertise, policy decision-making, multi-level governance, and then of course, a bit we have the accountability as a red thread, basically, you know, linking all these different concepts in this kind of, well, let's say, as a main focus in a way of the book project. To really maybe make a bit of clarification on the concept, well, we actually opted for a rather broad understanding of expertise, policy decision making, and this is also visible later on. Then you'll see the structure of the book. Basically, when we talk about expert, we don't only let's say encompass, let's say, the so-called scientists. So this kind of hard science domain, but also experts in other fields like financial, economic, legal experts. So basically, in our view, expertise in this context, in a way, covers let's say those individuals or these instances when actually decision making requires a certain level of knowledge of expertise. So then we have a broad understanding of expertise. Then when it comes to policy decision making, again, we take a rather broad view on the concept. So basically encompassing both formal and informal venues within the regulatory process. Actually, both in the context of evidence or scientifically based decision making, but also when policy formulation and implementation require specialized expertise or specialized knowledge, for instance, when conducting monetary policy. Then we have a bit of an adding this kind to already this kind of, well, let's say, complex relationship between expertise and policy decision making. The next, let's say, the additional layer of complexity is multi-level governance, where basically we define this, or we see this, we describe this analytically as situations where powers are exercised across national, European, and international legal frameworks by multiple public or quasi-public actors embedded normally in complex procedures, and which actually our assumption is that this concept, actually this reality after all, poses significant challenges from an accountability perspective. because, well, this kind of, let's say, intertwining and intermingling between various actors' processes across governance levels, actually, well, it's a factor posing or blurring accountability lines and accountability channels. And finally, as I said, we have, well, the accountability linking all these, in a way, the main focus throughout, let's say, these three previous concepts discussed. And again, here, well, we tend to take, let's say, a rather broader view on accountability. So basically seeing accountability on the one hand as some sort of a relational ideal, when actors exercising public power or authority are held to account for their performance to, well, let's say, a forum, which could be those subjected to that power, but also maybe not limited to that, also other actors which can act as accountability fora. So basically this kind of relation between actor and forum, so more or less like along the lines of the definitions by Bowens and Malden. But also we take a bit of a, let's say, broader perspective by looking at accountability also a bit as a widespread net. So basically including, let's say, the idea of controlling power along the lines of checks and balances, procedural safeguards, participation, but also as a factor enhancing legitimacy of let's say, decision-making, expert-based decision-making processes. And not only that, also maybe we also look at the dimension of accountability as a learning process, and thereby a way of somehow enhancing effectiveness of or efficiency, effectiveness of expert-based decision-making processes. So in a way, well, let's say the reason behind taking this kind of broad view on these concepts is in a way to have, well, the possibility to spread out the broader net in order to fish some interesting, let's say, fishes in terms of, well, corresponding or illustrating this kind of phenomenon of accountability of expert-based decision-making powers. And this also explains to a certain extent the variety and diversity among the chapters in this book. If we could move to the next slide. Thank you, Alessandra. Now, basically, in operationalizing these concepts, and in particular when it comes to the focus on accountability, we started by identifying certain challenges. And well, let's say here you have, let's say, perhaps some of the most important ones. And one of them, when it comes to, well, meaningful or effective accountability, is usually the knowledge asymmetry hurdle between the actor and the forum. And basically here we see the problem that where, let's say, the forum does not possess enough knowledge or information in order to assess the performance of the actor. Then, of course, even if on paper, let's say, formally speaking, accountability looks very good and maybe complete or, let's say, strong in terms of mechanisms, nevertheless, on the ground or in reality, it might actually prove quite defective, because actually the forum cannot properly assess the performance of the actor and then pass proper judgment on that. Then another challenge is, of course, the issue of independence and neutrality of experts. So basically here we see the problem in fine-tuning this balance between, you know, keeping the independence of the actor as an expert body, and at the same time holding it accountable. And perhaps, you know, a case in point here is maybe the European Central Bank, that will be discussed later on by my colleague Marijn, where actually we see a very high level of independence enshrined in the, well, let's say, EU constitutional framework. But at the same time, what does this mean in terms of accountability then? So can we actually reach or draw the balance between this large degree of independence and some sort of accountability, well, to ensure certain control and judging performance? Then we have, of course, the issue of effectiveness and efficiency of the policy decision-making process. And I think here the main one of the main issues is, well, designing maybe appropriate accountability mechanisms. So basically, for instance, within the EU context, when it comes to technocratic bodies, we have the constant kind of critique that, for instance, some of the technocratic bodies are subjected to too much accountability. So then here the idea is that, well, in a way, maybe one challenge is to somehow, you know, draw, well, good accountability or better accountability mechanisms, which is not too much, not too little to leave gaps, but at the same time ensure kind of meaningful judgment of performance and, you know, the ensuing consequences. Finally, we have the let's say last point of this slide deals with the idea of problematic or contested accountability. Well, problematic because in a way we see, well, some limits in the operationalization of this concept, in particular flowing from this kind of intermingling between actors, roles, policy decision-making, which actually, as I said before, also blurs the line of responsibility and renders accountability very difficult, if not sometimes impossible, especially when it comes to hot issues, so to say. I mean, COVID maybe is one of these situations, but in the book we have quite a nice example. This is very nicely illustrated with the glyphosate example, basically a chapter by Marta Morbillo in this book. And then, of course, we have the idea of, well, contested accountability. And here, actually, again, I think the ball will go back to my colleague Marijn, who's actually, well, contesting or criticizing accountability as a meaningful concept to, well, ensure, let's say, appropriate control when it comes to, in particular, expert bodies in the field of monetary policy, so ECB. Now, looking at so drawing on these concepts and then tackling these challenges, then we have this book overview, well, where basically we have the concept of the book relies on an idea of bringing together and linking theoretical perspectives on accountability of experts in multi-level governance with more specific applications of examinations of accountability in specific, in particular, policy areas. So as you can see, part one deals with these more horizontal theoretical perspectives on accountability and experts and decision-making processes, whereas parts 2, 3, and 4 actually come with this kind of well, let's say, case studies, as you can see, in different policy areas. So economic and financial law, environmental, health and food safety, law and governance, as well as digitization and data protection governance. And in the last part, actually, the focus is on 2 specific EU agencies, which actually are, well, let's say, experts in this field. So that's the European Network Information Security Agency and Europol. Now, basically, to give a broad overview of some of the findings or the main findings of the book, I would just focus on one specific point, well, on which, let's say, on which I joined in particular in my own chapter on Europol in part 4 of the book. And that is, actually looking at Europol in specific, bringing forward this kind of hybrid multi-level accountability concept for EU technocratic bodies. Actually, hybrid multi-level accountability. What does it mean? So multi-level is because it entails, well, multiple actors, fora and channels, cross-cutting EU and member states levels. Hybrid because, well, when it comes to holding the very same EU technocratic body, EU agency accountable, both EU institutions, bodies, and member states authorities are involved as accountability fora, always in quite intermingled and complex ways. And as I say, Europol provides a nice illustration in this respect, especially based on the latest, let's say, revised legal framework and under continuous revision as we talk, because there will be, well, soon, I think, a new or yet another revised or revived Europol regulation. And also, I take the view that, well, this accountability can be also a bit fluid. And this is in line with the general concept that we take in, well, we adopt in the book, where we see actually accountability, let's say, not so much of one moment, one retrospective moment of control, but rather, well, we see accountability as a continuous cycle, which, well, let's say, encompasses not only a retrospective perspective, but also a preventive perspective, or perspective one, actually, when performance or and standards and behavior is assessed and judged, well, based on, let's say, past conduct, but also based on, or can be also based on, let's say, anticipated kind of future conduct. For instance, when looking at or revising work programs of an agency like Europol. So finally, as I said, the focus in this chapter, whereby actually this concept of hybrid multi-level accountability is used, well, the focus is on Europol because this is perhaps the agency where, well, this kind of hybrid multi-level accountability is best illustrated in view of in particular when it comes to parliamentary scrutiny of Europol performance, which actually brings quite some interesting developments and structures. So mixed structures which bring together members of the European Parliament, but also members of the national parliaments, which work actually along with the European Parliament itself in order to hold Europol accountable. But my view is that, well, this hybrid multi-level accountability is very much relevant also for other EU agencies and technocratic bodies whose design and operation feature as a specific feature this kind of pooling or sharing of EU and national powers and resources, which in my view is rather, well, the hallmark of current degree of EU administrative integration. And with this, I pass the floor back to Alessandra for the next specific point.
Okay, thanks, Florin. Now I move to describe, to combine a description of some of the main findings of the theoretical part and the part two that's really focus on hard scientists. So we know that hard scientists, toxicologists, physicists, and so on and so forth are part of our policymaking processes. And of course, COVID is in the mind of everybody. We know all of a committee that helps government in taking these decisions. Here I have two pictures of some of the case studies that are in the book. So glyphosate is the most widely used pesticide in the world and has been at the center of a controversy in Europe. Now it should be reapproved, but we don't know. Well, probably it will. And there is typically a committee that decides on that. So now the problem with experts operating at this intersection of law, regulation, and policy is that they are situated in an interstitial space. And it is not easy to subject this actor to familiar form of accountability, like civil litigation, a civil liability or criminal liability. And then that's where the book offers this account of accountability as a constellation of mechanisms to tame power. And this emphasis on power that is quite central in the more theoretical part of the book is an important point because we conceptualize accountability as part and parcel of a public law approach and linked to what we call the teleological rule of law paradigm, where the goal is to tame power. So this is a central tenet in the conceptualization of accountability. And here is where the constellation of mechanisms are, which in this part of the book combines positive and normative analysis. Positive because we argue, actually, we already have many mechanisms of accountability that are at play. And I just, and through this vision, we can only think of accountability as both prospective and retrospective. So prospective, there are many cases in which it might be difficult to say, okay, we bring a scientist into court. And actually one of the inspiration of some of the work I've done in this area was this case, I don't know, many of you have heard of, where scientists have been tried after the earthquake in L'Aquila. So there was really a criminal case against scientists. And sometimes this ex post form of accountability might not be working perfectly, but there is many other that ex ante might be relevant and are relevant, especially in the particularly controversial nature of how experts relate to policy making. And also vis-a-vis the evidence that we have that science is often bent in when it's used for policy making processes. For example, there was a study published in Nature on more than 3,000 scientists showing that 1/3 of them, when they were working funded by a certain actor, were modifying the methodology under the pressure of the funding body. So there is quite some evidence that we need some form of accountability. And then there are conflict of interest, instrument, criteria for acceptable studies. So there is actually a plethora of this ex-ante mechanism. The second point is that while we think of experts as typically neutral, they are never neutral. But one of the key issues is how to disentangle what are legitimate values that experts can respond to in a normative framework from those that are illegitimate, so the classical vested interest. And finally, when we look at ex post, it's good to open up our horizon and think that courts are one fora, but there are many other. And the glyphosate case offers very interesting ideas on what these ex post fora are, because we had an European citizen initiative to ask a different way to regulate pesticides. We had ad hoc reports in other instances, for instance, in cases where there were scandals within decision-making process of the World Health Organization, sometimes back in the case of tobacco. In the case of glyphosate, we could see that there were two expert bodies actually releasing a report on safety, and this form of peer review could also be conceived as a form of accountability. All right, so because we are short of time, another driving theme or something which we don't have in the book, because the book was being finalized when the COVID pandemic erupted, and we didn't think it was wise to just throw any comments on that, but at least a short reflection that is in the book already is that here we see something where could be a bit of a cognitive dissonance for those who know Boris Johnson as one who was bashing experts, that all of a sudden in a U-turn is together always with this expert at the press conference is no exception. But as one scholar said, the sight of Boris Johnson and now various other ministers flanked at their daily press conferences by various scientific advisors is a strategic performative act of blame sharing and blame displacement. So this, by this we want to show with this iconic image of how sometimes using expert could be a way for politicians or other decision making to shift the blame away and actually to further conflate the politics with expertise role in the decision making. So one of the main lines is we should be able to disentangle this relation and design mechanisms to avoid this blame sharing of blame displacement. And in this sense, accountability actually, if for some has been looked at as a problematic for experts, could be twisted completely as perspective. It could become empowerment in the sense that we change the point of view of the relation to whom an expert is accountable. As they typically are embedded in certain institutions, what we try to show is that experts should not just be accountable to those in power, but to those affected by power. So there is not only a duty to accountability, but also a right. In a sense, the expert can talk to the body to which it responds typically and says, but my duty is towards another actor. And in that sense, from this perspective, meaningful accountability frameworks can avoid abuse of power by avoiding an abuse of expertise. And this also leads to one of the main conclusions, that accountability can be a shield for the role of expertise in public decision-making. In other words, if we want to have experts continuing to be an important part of our democratic society, then strengthening and reimagining the role of accountability is an essential element. And here, I I pass the word to one of the author of the book who didn't buy too much into the accountability framework as an important red thread to think of a legal regime where experts play an important role. So, Marijn, floor is yours.
Well, thank you, Alessandra, for inviting me to speak here and also for inviting me to contribute to the book. I think it's quite a step to write a book about accountability and then to invite someone to write about why accountability is really not the right concept to use, especially in my research with regard to the European Central Bank. So let me first outline a bit where I'm coming from, because accountability, as has been said, has been used from a very different perspectives. I talk about accountability as it is used by mainly legal scholars when they write about the European Central Bank. And there I encounter two problems, and as a modern scholar, I of course have to say that these problems are interconnected. So the first issue that I see is that accountability is not a constitutional requirement. As such, it is not mentioned in the EU treaties. It rarely appears in decisions by the Court of Justice of the European Union. You sometimes see it in, for example, the German Constitutional Court, and then even in the English translation. So it is not something that appears as a constitutional requirement as such. Now, it's of course important to remember that accountability consists of many elements. We've already talked about transparency. There is a judicial element. But I would argue that it is better to talk about separate issues as constitutional requirements than accountability as a whole. So, for example, when we talk about preventing abuse of power, I would say, and the requirement of a form of judicial accountability, I would say that the requirements of the rule of law, or the German version of the Rechtsstaat, are much better suited to talk about these issues. So the more common, the core constitutional requirement. And since accountability is not as such a constitutional requirement, I often encounter difficulties when I see these legal papers about the European Central Bank, when they often conclude that there is an issue, there is a problem with accountability for the European Central Bank. I mean, that's something that's been said over the past 20 years. Because I don't know what the meaning of that conclusion is. I don't know who's supposed to fix it, where the responsibility lies. I don't know why I should per se care about it. As I see it, the level of accountability is often very much a political choice. One, we can create very independent institutions, and politicians might have various reasons to do so. And in general, I would say that is not a problem. So it's up to politicians to decide what they want in terms of, how they set up a different organizations, given that they are in line with specific constitutional requirements, but accountability is not one of them. So that's the first issue. So the first issue is that I don't see it as I don't think it is a constitutional requirement, and therefore it becomes hard to criticize a supposed lack of accountability. The second part is that the concept of accountability is deductive. It is usually described relatively out of thin air as a concept that is supposed to apply or not apply. And especially with regard to the ECB, there is, as I see it, very little attention to the traditional mechanisms through which bodies or institutions have been embedded, with how checks and balances are applied, or the historical functions of institutions. So that's it is a rather abstract requirement that is, as we know, is applied in a variety of ways. But most of them are not, they do not start with a thorough look at an institution and then slowly construct an image of accountability. Rather, it's the other way around. We start with different conceptions of accountability and then see how it works with various institutions. So that's my two general problems with accountability. So Alessandra, if you could go to the next slide. So in the book, I then set out the question. So, okay, if not accountability, how do we examine, how do we criticize the European Central Bank? So the first part on the the accountability not being a constitutional requirement. So how then do we go about criticizing the ECB if it is in any way to be criticized? So I would say, first of all, it's not a problem that the ECB is not sufficiently accountable. I would say what matters is that, we criticize it at the right moment with the right institutions. And that is the member states who created the European Central Bank. So if anything, we should criticize the Maastricht Treaty for creating a very independent institution. And then the question, of course, becomes, what is the benchmark? What are we criticizing it on? What should they have taken into account? And there I would say many constitutions have requirements of democracy built into the constitution. And I've worked on an argument, for example, with regard to the Dutch constitution, where I would say the Dutch parliament is not allowed to ratify a treaty that creates a institution similar to those as the European Central Bank. So embedded with a constitution-like treaty that then creates a hyper independent institution. So there I would say there's a very specific requirement of democracy, and that prevents, which should prevent parliaments from ratifying such a treaty. So it is basically the reverse from what the German Constitutional Court is saying about the requirement of democracy, where the German Constitutional Court says you can't ratify treaties that transfer certain competences since we are the only proper democratic venue. I would say that the reverse should apply, that a democracy cannot ratify a treaty that creates an institution so independent as the ECB if it is not embedded with a proper democratic rights around it. So that's, I would say, is the proper way to examine the ECB, to go to the core to say the problem is with the Maastricht Treaty. Once we accept it, if we would accept the Maastricht Treaty, then I don't see any ground for criticizing a lack of accountability. So the second part then is how was, so if we do not take that deductive accountability approach, how should we examine more from an in-depth perspective the way the European Central Bank works? And there I would say it's surprising that many works on accountability of central banks, and especially the European Central Bank, do not look at the interaction between central banks and the ministries of finance, which I would say is the core route through which expertise has traditionally been challenged in a quite effective manner. Even for an independent institution, an independent body like the German Bundesbank before the euro, the fact that they were independent did not stand in the way for a back and forth, a power sharing when it came to the achievement of the goals, both of the Bundesbank and of the German government, especially the Ministry of Finance. So a Minister of Finance and a central bank, they used to need each other. They needed each other in order to achieve certain goals. And because they were dependent on each other for the realization of their goals, they were very interested in what the other was doing. At the Ministry of Finance, there were always plenty of people who really know what a central bank is doing and allow a proper contestation of expertise. So with the European Central Bank, that dynamic starts to shift, because it's not one central bank versus one Ministry of Finance. It's one central bank versus a multitude of ministries of finance. So there's not that one-on-one relationship anymore. So there's a different way in which these institutions are forced to listen to each other. They can still speak, but the others are not forced to listen. And I would say when we talk about the ECB and how it's embedded, I think that's one of the core elements of why it has been so difficult to engage with the European Central Bank, on top of the fact that it is embedded within the treaties from a constitutional perspective. So to sum up, I would say that the accountability debate of the ECB misses the mark from a normative perspective and provides very little analytical insight into why the ECB can act the way it does. Thank you. And then, of course, the floor is back to Alessandra and Florin.
I guess we'll start with in the room for questions and then we'll go to Zoom. So there's nobody over there. Okay. So would anybody, do we have any volunteers to ask a question from this group? Not yet. Okay. Gabby, if you're there, do you want to look through the Zoom and see if you see a question there?
Yeah, thank you very much. Thanks, David. Sorry, I haven't heard the introduction because at a certain point we were only having the audio. So sorry if I was a bit late with the chat. So far, we don't have any questions in the chat. But maybe if you don't mind, and thank you all for your presentation of this really great book, and especially to Alessandra, it's great to see you again, because at a certain point we were Jean Monnet fellows. Actually, Jan has a question. Maybe before I come in, Jan, do you want to come in?
Yes. Gabby, let's let the audience do questions first, and then you and I can ask
Absolutely.
questions when we're ready. Okay.
Absolutely.
Okay, so my question in a way connects up with something that came up in the last of these meetings that we had when I was presenting on peer review, and it seems to me that to again come up here, part of it is that, I mean, as you are presenting it, you seem to kind of sort of be suggesting that there is a division between kind of, expert decision making and sort of, let's say, policy decision making. But, one of the points that we were discussing last time is that there seems to me a three levels of distinction. There's experts, which we usually understand as kind of like, scientific experts. Then there is experts in the, let's say, regulatory craft, and these are sort of, let's say, sometimes called technocrats. And then there is the third, which is basically sort of, the political decision making, where, there is also the kind of let's say the risk balancing that occurs, by politicians. And it seems to me that, to the extent that there is a loss of trust in expertise, part of it is that, it's more than, there is more than one interstice. It's kind of at least two different interstices where you can kind of lose essentially, what the expert input is, what's the degree of uncertainty also within the expert kind of community, and then how that travels to efficiency of implementing certain rules and regulations, which is sort of, the technocratic part, and then the political decision making of what do we do in this specific case. And I wonder to what extent that kind of, that comes out in the various case studies that you are studying as a way of basically undermining trust in experts. And then my second question actually goes to this question of independence. Again, there is this idea that, experts are independent and that there are certain things that are kind of certain considerations that are proper for them to take into account and others that are not. So, for instance, the improper is vested interests. And I just am not aware of these kind of oracular Delphic experts that can, exist in a completely independent space. I mean, you basically need the information, including from the vested interests. And the key is that it just not be only from the vested interests. So, once you're talking about embedding, it's kind of embedding in multiple communities. It's not just with the politician, the minister, as in Marijn's example, but, central banks are also very deeply embedded with the banks that they regulate. And then, there are all of these other more dispersed interests where they're sort of, less well embedded. So I think that there were questions on both of those. Maybe they were just comments, but I would love to hear what the authors of the book would have to say about those points. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you very much. Shall we go in the direction of the presentations? Maybe Alessandra, you to start, and then Florin and Marijn.
Yeah, sure. Thanks.
Thank you.
So thanks, Jane, for the excellent question. And apologies, I was not there at the previous meeting, but I couldn't attend. I think you raised a number of points. One is first for clarificatory purposes. Indeed, we use a very broad category for experts. So we include both the first layer, the hard scientists, but also the more technocrats, so the economists, we are the economics faculty. So there is multiple types of expertise that are all clustered into one category. And in fact, context matters. And so things could change depending on where are we, the type of cases we are looking at. Now, let me relate this to the part that I'm most familiar with, that is where hard scientists are part of the decision-making process. And here there is a first type of comment is that they do exercise quite some influence, in the sense that if you look at these studies when it is about food safety or the safety of pesticides, often there is the study and the policy-making decision almost always follow the study. And in fact, from observation, for example, in this case of glyphosate, I went to also some meetings at the European Parliament, and some parliamentarians at one point, especially one, said, okay, so but what should we do? There seems that this dualism has also led the politician to shy away from its own responsibility, that is to see, okay, what are the values we are considering and what are the risks we want to take? This is first line of answering. The second is the question of vested interest. There, I would be a little bit more, not radical, but quite firm on something that, yes, it's true that experts are embedded. They have to know, for example, again, when it comes to environment, safety, food safety, public health, they have to have connection to the industry. And yet, maybe we have gone too far. And here, so there are quite some important studies that show how certain experts have been working for the industry a very long time. And so this intertwinement of actors that move from the private to the public so naturally is problematic, especially for the loss of trust that we see, that then could lead to total anti-scientism, but where there is a problem in the type of institutions we design. And on that point, I would refer to a book by Antoine Vaucher on France, where he shows how public officials move very easily from the public to the private and back, blurring this line. And I think when it comes to expertise, if the expert is set to make studies for the public interest, it is problematic that it moves without much, without enough hesitation from the public to the private. And in that sense, conflict of interest rules, check on studies, and so on and so forth are important tools that are, in my view, from what I studied in those cases, rather underdeveloped. They are really at their infancy. And if we want to keep our democracy in shape, I think they should be strengthened. I think I'll keep it here. I can go on and talk, but we are many. So I don't know if Florin, Marijn, if you want to add something on that.
Yeah, I would. Oh, sorry, Florin, you go first.
Sorry, very just quickly, maybe just building a bit on what Alessandra said. So thank you, Jane, for the wonderful questions and of course the difficult ones. indeed, I mean, let's say that we embedded, as we mentioned, different types of expertise and experts, and well, we try to find the common ground there. So then, basically, backing up or even providing the necessary expertise in the decision-making process. So, but of course, we have a lot of different situations. So we have, for instance, experts which advise, let's say, decision or policymakers or decision-making bodies or actors. And then we also have expert bodies who basically also take the decision as expert bodies, like EU agencies or even the ECB. So then here again, we might need different kind of let's say a framework sometimes, or a fine-tuned framework also for assessing the performance in light of the role and powers of the experts, but and the decision-making the decision makers, with a view to maybe draw certain consequences based on that and ensure certain kind of controls also in terms of accountability. And when it comes to the third question, actually, indeed, this relativized independence of experts through vested interest and embeddedness is indeed an issue, as also Alessandra mentioned. But I would say that this kind of, let's say, relative or let's say involvement with vested interest should not be without limits. And I think in this case, maybe law indeed can and should set, the limit and criteria for let's say in a way, the intermingling or relationship between the expert and the industry of various vested interests, and basically establish various kind of safeguards or requirements based on which experts and even policymakers can be held accountable. I will now leave it to this and pass the floor to Marijn.
Thank you. I would just build on my story and say, from a political perspective, I would agree with Florin and Alessandra. I would like, as a private citizen, I would like to have stricter limits on how independent experts engage with vested interest. From a constitutional perspective, I really don't see what the issue is. If the legislator wants to create a body that's half private interest, half public regulation, okay, yeah, sure, go ahead. I think it's a bad idea, but constitutional law is not there to prevent all bad ideas. So I would say that's the question from Florin for more regulation, I would see as a purely political requirement with no deeper constitutional basis.
So, well, I would react to Marijn. We have continuous conversation, but I see a couple of questions in the room, and on maybe Gabi, it's an idea to collect a few questions.
Yeah, exactly. I do have from the online audience, I think Vincenzo on my list. So far, I don't see any. And shall we have Vincenzo first and then go to the room?
Yes, thank you. I think this presentation is very interesting, but there are several dimensions. Some are constitutional, legal, some other are more societal, I believe, especially in the current times. So first of all, I agree with the last intervention that the example of the European Central Bank is probably not the right one, because the European Central Bank in the European treaties is an institution, is not an agency. So it's as the same status that the Council, the European Parliament, or the Commission. Is totally different from Europol, so their decisions are binding and mandatory. That doesn't mean that their independence is without control, because as any institution, they have to act according to the provision on which they are being created. So, for example, the famous clause of no bailout, if the central bank does not respect this clause, it's responsible and accountable in front of the European Court of Justice, not the single constitutional court. And this was a famous case. So I think European Central Bank is not probably the best example, and you cannot compare with the Europol or the Environmental Agency or other bodies that exist both at European and national level, for example, in the field of competition, telecommunication, and so on. But I think an interesting element in your presentation that could be maybe developed is the difference between bodies, technical bodies advising political decision makers and individual experts. And this is very, very important now in the current situation where many governments are relying on the opinion of experts that are not necessarily part of a technical body, but are technical advisor of prime minister or minister of health, etc. So I don't believe very much in the fact that these people could remain invisible. In fact, they are very visible because they are on the screens every night. And also that they start to become, in a certain sense, accountable. By the way, even the metaphor used at the beginning, Ulysses, was made fully accountable by Poseidon very soon after blinding his son. So the myth of unaccountability, even in the Greek mythology, was not very effective. In the digital society, is totally ineffective. But this is a very important element because when there is this tendency to displace the blaming, and this is an area in which this is a very interesting operation. If you don't identify who is the final decision maker, you risk to have a general mistrust of the public opinion vis-a-vis of the science, not only of the experts. So I think this is the real question today. How the opinion of experts, both individual experts or administrative or technical bodies, can be channeled into legal framework and then challenged in courts or in political arena, and also how to try to distinguish the value of the different opinion, because this is another element. I mean, the political decision makers cannot simply take the opinion without making a sort of comparison with other opinion and then decide and assuming the responsibility for this decision.
Thank you very much, Vincenzo. Alessandra, before we give to the room, I still have Luisa here online. So I would wrap that up and then give over to you, Luisa, please.
Yes, thanks for this interesting presentation. And I'm very happy to see colleagues that I didn't see for a long time. I have a couple of perhaps or questions or feedbacks. And one question is for Florin. And actually, you've been working on Europol, but you've been working as well on other agencies. And I was wondering if, let's say, especially in the agencies like Frontex and EASO, you see like the challenge of experimentalist governance as a further challenge of designing hybrid multi-level accountability structures, because as we have seen, these agencies have been changing quite rapidly, growing, and even let's say the practice goes ahead if compared to the legal mandate to some extent. So I think that this is also quite a challenge in terms of designing. It looks like a moving target. And so this looks to me also like, yeah, a challenge to design accountability structures, and perhaps also a remark or a question to Marijn van der Sluis, because I mean, I'm fascinated by the way you would say that, let's say we have some desired accountability, but we have constitutional constraints which does not require such a these constraints. So I also wonder whether you are kind of using a thin idea of constitutionalism to some extent. I mean, it's more something on which I will have to work on, but I really wonder whether one can be so clear cut in saying that, you know, from the constitutional perspective, that's not mandated. I mean, we think that there could be, you know, a thicker idea of constitutional constraints. So yeah, that was my remark.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Luisa. Actually, very good point, the last one on the implicit proxies for accountability in the constitutions. Absolutely. Alessandra, how do you want to go about? Take these two questions and reply and then go to the room? Maybe that would be a good start.
Maybe I'll just give a quick answer to the questions of Vincenzo. First, thanks a lot. When it comes to challenging the metaphor, I should say I did think, okay, how do we go about Poseidon and what happens next? And I thought, well, that's interesting because it's about the hubris of expertise in a sense. So we took the literary license to cut off the metaphor, but at the same time, I would say that if we take it further, it does hint at the problem of the hubris of expertise in democratic system. Now, to be a little bit more concrete on one of your questions of how can it be channeled into a legal framework, this accountability, there I've been quite practical about that because any expert judgment, even the one of hard scientists, are framed within normative framework. So just to give very simple example, the toxicologist can choose a methodology among many plausible that can be more or less conservative, detect more false negative or false positive. And here we do have embedded, and here I also take a much thicker constitutionalist perspective, because we have, especially as an international lawyer who is always in search of constitutional documents that we don't have, kind of. So if you look at constitutive documents of international organizations where in food safety, the Codex Alimentarius Commission, actually you excavate and you find those. So for example, in the case of risk regulation, there is a clear reference to precaution. What does it mean for an expert? It means something, right? It means that among different plausible scientific model, you could choose one that is more conservative when it comes to detecting false positive, or in other words, to detect, for instance, a risk to public health, which is usually the opposite of the standard status quo of what scientists tend to do, because you don't want to have this type of mistakes. So in other words, yes, it is possible. I think we are limiting our institutional fantasy and constitutional fantasy when it comes to channel how an expert can relate to a legal framework. It can, and it knows. So, and this comes from also interviews I did with some of the experts working in these bodies, who were telling me, for example, how do we, what type of definition do we use? And I've heard the answer, we're very conscious of what we are doing. So when experts are embedded in policymaking, they also know, so they can be honest about the steps that are being taken and the choices that are made in order to come to a scientific assessment of a certain situation. We always in science have uncertainty, otherwise we denature the business of coming to knowledge, let's say, whatever type of knowledge production institution we think of, from the hard scientists to the economy. So I think the other questions were speaking more to Marijn and Florin, so I...
Yeah, maybe, just few remarks regarding Marijn's comments, and then also the question of Vincenzo Grassi. By the way, thank you very much for the wonderful questions. So indeed, I very much agree. Indeed, ECB, let's say it's definitely different from EU agencies. Not only considering, let's say, the powers that ECB, well, actually indeed takes binding decisions, whereas most agencies, let's say, do not. Though, well, we also have, let's say, in a way, black swans. So we have increasingly agencies that can also take certain direct decision-making powers, like ESMA, for instance. But nevertheless, they remain, let's say, on the level of secondary legislation, so below the constitutional level, which, of course, is not the case for ECB. But what I see still here, I mean, also reacting a bit on Marijn's point of view, that, well, the fact that, well, accountability is not enshrined explicitly in the treaty, so then this is not an issue. This is not something that is relevant for the ECB. Well, not sure really about this, because, I mean, if we accept that, we have, certain principles in the treaties, like the rule of law, principle of institutional balance. Then we have, of course, all the general principles of conferral, subsidiarity, proportionality, which also applies to the EU institutions, which basically moves a bit, you know, the focus on, well, EU decision-making in general, so also by its institutions, including the ECB, on the issue of, you know, exercising EU comfort powers and how to control such powers. Then, of course, to the extent that, well, we admit that there should be certain control on ECB's powers. And of course, if accountability, let's say, encompasses the idea of controlling power, well, we have, for instance, in our book, the idea of ex post, but also ex ante, a bit control, then definitely maybe accountability could be used as an analytical category for actually controlling potentially abusive power by the ECB. So I don't think that this is not necessarily solely politically backed kind of idea, but I think it founds really important, let's say, fundamentals or foundations in the EU constitutional framework itself and in its basic, foundational principles. Regarding Luisa's question, well, I think, Luisa, indeed, you have a very good point that, well, we have quite speedy developments in the EU agencies, let's say, legal framework, and I think not only Frontex but also Europol is a prime example. As you know, just few years after the last, important new founding regulation, now we have another one ongoing, and I think that indeed, designing accountability structures for such agencies remains a challenge and a moving target. You are right on this, but to me, I think the direction in the end should go towards this kind of, idea of hybrid accountability, basically involving increasingly not only EU level institutions and bodies, but also national authorities. I mean, the more powers I would say are granted to these agencies in the constant making, I think the more administrative integration we have at EU level, which I think in turn requires indeed designing, I think, new adjusted accountability structures, which take into account also, as I said, this kind of hybrid nature of the EU agencies. So not only supranational, but also as intergovernmental bodies and actually exercising powers and tasks increasingly, comfort from the EU, from the level of the member states. I'll stop here. Now I pass the floor to Marijn. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Florin. So first on the issue on how to compare the ECB to agencies, issue raised by Vincenzo Grassi. Thank you. Yeah, that's, of course, the ECB is very different in how it's constituted, how it's created, which powers it has, which tasks it has, how it's judicially controlled, how it engages with the European Parliament. But I would say that does not fundamentally change how we can look at it from a legal constitutional perspective. We have to look at, do we think that it should be allowed how it is created? And that's a question we can ask both about Europol and about the ECB. We can ask the question would it be okay if Europol would be created if the entire, chapter on parliamentary scrutiny would not have been included? And I think the answer is yes, that would have been allowed, and also would have been okay from a constitutional perspective. Most importantly, because the European Parliament and the Council could have changed it rather easily. They could have easily, give the Europol an insane amount of powers, put on no parliamentary scrutiny, and I think it's fine, mostly because Parliament itself can correct. With the European Central Bank, that's of course not the issue. So there, I think the issue, the problem becomes that it's so difficult to basically get rid of the European Central Bank, to amend its tasks, to fire the people in charge, which we can do for Europol. We can just tomorrow abolish Europol. It wouldn't really be an issue. So yes, they're different, but I would say the principles still apply in the same way. Just the way we work them through, I would say, would be different. So responding to Luisa Marin's comment is how can we apply a broader sense of constitutionalism? Because of course most of my argument here rests on the simple fact that it is not included in any constitutional text. So could we use a set of principles? There, I would say it's first of all, I would love it if many of the accountability debates would actually start doing that, if they would start engage with the constitutionalism debates and what is required by constitutional principles. Because then we could also have the debate on whether things would be allowed to create them in a certain way, and we could actually start saying, no, you're not allowed as a parliament to create this or that. But I never see that coming from the accountability debate. So I would agree that would be a great addition to the debates. My response would be that we can disentangle the many elements of accountability, and it would be much more beneficial to just engage with the separate elements than with the term accountability. If we say democracy or parliaments or democratic legislators are not allowed to create a certain institution, then you would have to argue, why not? Why wouldn't they not be allowed to do that? Why would democracy be limited in creating something that would be perhaps a bit undemocratic? Well, they might know best about where that lies. So we have to come up with arguments. Okay, here's what democracy is allowed to create or not. And here's how you can create an institution that might escape judicial scrutiny. And then you talk about the requirements of the rule of law. But I would say it's much more, the debate becomes much clearer if we just get rid of the accountability term and start focusing on individual, already well-known aspects of constitutionalism. That would be a much clearer debate.
Okay, Philip, I think we had a question. Maybe you need a microphone. Maybe you can move this one over there.
That's fine. Thank you very much. So I have two questions. The first one I take from the final part of the presentation. One that resonated very much with me is, why do we care about accountability? Because if we look at the ECB, I mean, whether there's, for example, a parliamentary oversight committee or not, I don't care, and I'm an economist. I think maybe monetary policy wonks would care. I don't know if my parents or grandparents would care. And Marijn, you gave a very specific example. The German Constitutional Court cares. And I think they have very specific reasons to care that come out of their mandate, out of their mission and their goals. So I'm wondering, isn't there some kind of big disconnect between very vague and broad calls for more accountability on the one side, and on the other side, recognizing that there are very specific stakeholders that care about accountability, and usually a very specific aspect of accountability that has to do with their own interests? And after analyzing, for example, the political economy of the circumstances, we might come to the conclusion, okay, actually, we don't want the ECB to be accountable to the German Constitutional Court because it does not serve the purpose for why we would set up the ECB. Maybe we don't want it this way. I feel like accountability and also often transparency are used like big, vague cliches without much examination of why we would want that. And that leads to my second question. I'm wondering, isn't this whole discussion of accountability based on the completely wrong model of expertise? It made me think of something I recently read by Jean Drèze. He's a development economist who was involved with designing a lot of social policy in India. And he wrote a very interesting text about the difficulties of translating expertise to policy, where he basically criticized, he asserted you can have 10 randomized control trials that prove that a simple intervention is very effective and helpful, but that doesn't mean you should put it into policy, because there's a big step from having evidence that X causes Y to really understanding a problem. And then there's a disconnect between really understanding a problem and designing an effective policy to solve it. And he said there's a problem that experts might be very good at understanding the academic issue, but they might not be very good to do the practical implementation, and they might not be very good at solving the political trade-offs. And it seems to me that accountability is used as a tool to give some veneer of political legitimacy to experts, to give them, in a sense, the right to solve a political trade-off, when that's kind of missing the point. The comparative advantage, to use an economics term, of the experts is to do their independent thing, give their independent advice. And then it's the comparative advantage or the role of the politician to make the political decision to solve the trade-off in one or the other direction, and an entirely different thing altogether to have the expertise to do the practical implementation. So I'm wondering, is this whole accountability discussion perhaps misguided in that sense? Thank you.
More questions in the room? Okay. I'm just going to, since we're collecting questions, I'll just say, since we're on the topic of the ECB, I don't view the ECB as particularly independent. The Germans run the place. They do whatever the Germans pull the strings and they dance the tune. I don't see what issue of accountability there is for. Maybe you don't like them being accountable to the Germans. I could understand that, but they're not an independent organization by any stretch of the imagination.
All right, thanks for, I love these questions. Oh, if I can disentangle my mask from the glasses. These are the killer questions. I love them because actually they also give you the opportunity to tell, okay, why do you engage in this project? And all right, first, I've been working at this intersection where experts are very active throughout my career in risk regulation, etc. And here you see this type of debate that are kind of circular, and we always end up in this nicely neat distinction. Okay, let the expert do what they know, and then there is the politician and they do what they know. It just doesn't work. That's, I mean, we live in complex society. So do I like the term accountability? Do I like the way it has been used in the literature? No, I don't. Do I have a better term? No, I don't, because yeah, maybe we could think of constitutionalism, but I would say, or maybe a better frame would have been the counter-democracy of Rosanne Vallon applied to experts. Okay, so probably there could have been a better term, but we thought, okay, we just stick to this one, but then radically unpack it and try to give it more meaning. And the reason to do that is exactly because it doesn't work like this. We are not going to get rid of experts, because you like it or not, you're not going to do a COVID policy without immunologists. They are with us to stay, and for good reasons, I would say, but we should get rid of this dualism. And the funny thing is that if we look at debates that are decades older, there was always this idea, okay, the relation should be circular between the expert and the policymaker, but we kind of don't manage to get that step beyond. And in this way, by unpacking and distinguishing the various dimensions, and in that, I think with Marijn, we may seem in big contrast, but in fact, we agree on many things, that is about dissecting the various aspects. So how do we make these experts interact in a meaningful way with the politicians and with the decision maker, and the other way around? So with the politician and decision maker that relate meaningful, saying, okay, these are the questions that we're asking, these are responsibility that we are taking in asking this question and not asking others. And this relates also to I think something that was said before about the experts that now are very visible. And I think on that line, I think Vincenzo raised the point that these days I wouldn't want to be in one of these committees for COVID, because you could have the mob after your door, you know, but that's the whole point also, that it's reductivist to think of public scrutiny as yet the only form of accountability. We have actors in society that are intermediator, like civil society organization and so on and so forth, that have that expertise to talk with the experts. So also this idea that there is an expert that has monopoly of knowledge in a society where knowledge is produced in various sites is also problematic one. So the pluralism, and we discuss about pluralism in this book as well. So this is to say, well, yes, I think we may have chosen another name, but the idea is to put the expert central to the analysis and try to unpack the relations that she has with others. On monetary policy, I am not supposed to comment, even because we are recording, but I would say, and then I pass the word on, that why do we care about accountability? Who cares about monetary policy? I would say, well, let's ask to the people that suffer from monetary policy. I mean, we as lawyer, if we don't care, it's just because we don't know enough about it. But this is a central dimension of policy. And as a lawyer, I tend to become totalitarian because all institutions are embedded in legal institutions. And so you guys need us and we need you, but you need us. So monetary policy is fundamental. And I think the question of accountability is crucial. Maybe it has been asked in the wrong way. And fortunately, we have Marijn who is working on that. And I have a big hope on what he will deliver and is delivering so far. But monetary policy is not something for few experts of monetary law, because monetary policy affects the daily life of millions of people. So that should change fora where it is discussed, how it is discussed, how it is made. But I don't say much more because it's not my piece of cake. So I'll put.
We're down to about 5 minutes at this point. So we have time for responses from the other two, but let's try to be relatively quick.
Yeah, maybe very quickly, and then I'll pass the floor to Marijn. So indeed, the issue of let's say accountability, maybe not being the golden standard as we put it in one of the slides, but nevertheless maybe the least let's say well, at least being still let's say good enough to capture this kind of situation, and maybe indeed the challenge is somehow to taking into account this intermingling between well, policymakers, so let's say the risk management part and expertise, let's say the risk assessment part when it comes to policy decision making and expertise-based decision making. But at the same time, keep somehow things distinguishable in the way that, well, design maybe, this kind of, or assess accountability depending on the specific role of each particular actor. For instance, you can think about more peer reviewing accountability mechanism when it comes to experts involved in decision making, and maybe more kind of, democratic accountability mechanisms when it comes to those taking ultimately the ultimate, let's say, political decision. I will stop to this. Well, this is perhaps, well, not sure whether this is mission impossible, but I think indeed, I tend to agree with Alessandra that, well, maybe it's difficult to find, well, let's say, in a way, an acceptable alternative to this. So now I pass the floor to Marijn.
Thank you. Well, on the issue on the relevance of accountability, I would tend to agree that many of the issues in modern governance are just from a democratic or accountability perspective, just not that interesting. There's many issues we don't particularly care about, right? In the modern democratic debate, there's many issues which we can settle happily by experts, even when there's a certain level of capture by vested interest, if they're just done reasonably well. And if something goes wrong, we would need the democratic tools to intervene. So I think it's a democracy is about learning to do policies better. So if something's not working right, if the example that Alessandra raised, the safety of your iPhone, if there turned out to be a big problem, well, I would want members of parliament to be able to intervene. but it's not necessary to be accountable to have all experts on the be called into parliament to answer questions on a daily basis. So it's about designing a broader mechanism to embed experts. On the issue of is the ECB really that independent, or is it basically run by the Germans? Since we have very little time, I think I can conclude with the observation that I have a German father-in-law who is a bit conservative, who would very strongly disagree with you. So I don't think that's I don't think it's the case that the ECB is not independent and basically just run by the Germans. So I would leave it at that.
Well, maybe this is a good point to stop as we're running quite low on time. I thank the authors of the book for a wonderful book and a wonderful discussion. I thank the audience for their wonderful questions, and I enjoyed the discussion, the answers. So thank you, everybody. And this group's not going to meet again until the new year. So everybody have a very good Christmas and a wonderful new year. And thank you all.
So from